Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. My name is Jed Lea-Henry, your host, and on today's show we have Daniel Sneider. So we are now 2 days removed from the Inter-Korean Summit, and everyone is now looking towards the end of May, where Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un will meet. This will be the first time any North Korean leader has met with a sitting American president. So it is important to look back at this most recent summit and see just what happened, to pull out the small details. And as Daniel Sneider will show through our discussions together, just how dangerous these talks can be. When it comes to North Korea, we have been here before. In 1972, there was the joint communique. In 1994, there was the agreed framework. After this, there was a series of statements that came out of the six-party talks, and 2 armistice agreements in 2009 and 2013. So, to take a broader historical perspective on this, it's hard to get too excited about the statement that came out on Friday and was signed by Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in. The language was ambiguous. And for talks like this, ambiguous language is incredibly dangerous. It leaves open loopholes. It leaves all the details still to be filled in. And it means if it all falls apart, someone is going to be blamed for tearing apart a piece that seemed, if only superficially, to exist. Kim Jong-un walked into these talks with a good faith propaganda victory already under his belt. He could claim that he came to the table, that he made the first move, and he made a bold concession up front. But of course, that bold concession, denuclearization, likely means very different things to North Korea, South Korea, and America. Bypassing ordinary diplomatic processes, this has been a summit, as will be the next summit with Donald Trump, that moves straight to the highest level of diplomacy. There is nowhere else to go after this. Ordinarily, these things grow from the ground up, the details are ironed out, and the leaders only ever meet to rubber stamp the process. What we are seeing now is an inversion of this. The document signed by Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un spoke of a new era of peace, of reunification, of a common goal, and of non-aggression, but it left so much open, so much unanswered. And of course, from this comes the skeptical concern that this is all disingenuous by North Korea, that at some point, some way, they will find a way to break this agreement, to back out, to resume their nuclear program, and to do so at a time that suits them. As important as talks can be, they can, as Daniel Sneider will show, lead instead to conflict and war. There is so much to be hopeful about in what we are currently seeing, but there is so much more to be concerned about. Drawing open these ideas, Daniel Sneider published an article the day before the Inter-Korean Summit entitled, "A Declaration of Peace That Leads to War." Throughout this interview, we are going to open up the ideas that he touches upon in this article, paint a broader picture of the challenges and the concerns around these summits, and look forward to where this is likely to lead. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast and you consider it in any way valuable, please consider donating at the Patreon link attached to this page, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is Daniel Sneider. Daniel Sneider, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to be speaking about the Inter-Korean Summit and the article that you wrote about this the day before it started. But just first, I might get you to go back and give us a brief history of your relationship to the Korean Peninsula and the relationship of your family as well, because it's quite a unique kind of history you have.
Well, my father was a career Foreign Service officer, and his career was spent almost entirely dealing with Japan and Korea. And in a way, Korea was kind of the bookends of his career in the Foreign Service, because he began in the late 1940s working in the State Department's intelligence department. And he had come out of the war. He was a Japanese language officer during the war, and he was recruited to the Japan desk of State Department intelligence. And the story goes in my family that in somewhere around 1949, he was assigned to the newly created North Korea desk. And my mother used to always say that my father thought his career was over at that point, because he had been sent off to this obscure desk, which amounted to two people sitting in an office that used to be a closet in the old State Department intelligence building. Well, of course, the Korean War broke out, and my father's career took a slightly different turn, and he was a member of a four-man intelligence team that went into Pyongyang during the brief period when the city was under the occupation of the U.S. 8th Army. And they together did the first intelligence research project on North Korea, and they did a study of North Korea as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. It was secret and declassified only in the early 1960s. It's still a subject of some controversy amongst North Korea scholars. But that was sort of how his career started, but he didn't really, he dealt with Korea a lot over the ensuing 2 decades, but he returned to Korea really in 1974 as the U.S. ambassador, and that time period was a really turbulent one in the U.S.-Korean relationship. It's the time of the sort of aftermath of the attempted assassination of Park Chung-hee, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Korea, and the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. We were embroiled with issues of human rights, of Park Chung-hee's dictatorship, and of course the secret nuclear weapons program, which Park Chung-hee initiated, the Koreagate scandal, and then of course the decision of the newly elected President Jimmy Carter to withdraw U.S. forces from Korea. My father had to deal with all of that. I wrote an article once for the Washington Post during the Nomu-hyun era entitled "The Myth of the Golden Age," because there was this idea out there that when the progressives were in power in South Korea, and particularly the No administration and its tensions with the Bush administration, that this was sort of unprecedented in our relationship with Korea. And in fact, it was hardly unprecedented. We've had tensions forever. Anyway, that's sort of what I grew up with, and it's my reference point still. In fact, I teach a class on U.S. foreign policy in Northeast Asia, and I like to look back at the whole process of quiet diplomacy as it was practiced by my father in the 70s, quite controversially, because there are many people who thought we should have been more confrontational. And later on, I worked as a reporter in Korea, starting in the mid-1980s. I was based in Tokyo for the Christian Science Monitor, and I went back and forth to Korea, and I was there during covering the collapse of the uprising against the military regime of Chun Do-won, and I spent a lot of time with Kim Dae-jung, who once told me that he credited my father, among others, with having saved his life from the regime. On the other hand, he pointed out to me, his view was that kind of quiet diplomacy, while it saved his life, it also left Koreans with the deep impression that the United States, in public at least, was really synonymous with the military regime. It's sort of the dilemma of American foreign policy. Anyway, I spent a lot of time in Korea particularly since the mid-'80s, and it's been a part of my life and my family's life, and it remains so.
Great. And for people listening, you are working on a book about your father too, so in the future, everyone keep their ears and eyes out for that. So we'll just move on. So on Friday, of course, was the Inter-Korean Summit. And the day before the summit, you published an article with a great title, and it's called A Declaration of Peace That Leads to War. So just before we get into the real meat of this, were there any surprises? Because the piece begins with a series of predictions that you make. And as far as I can see, you're quite accurate. Was there anything that caught you off guard, or anything that surprised you about this?
It was such a well choreographed event, and planned in great detail, that it wasn't hard to be accurately predictive about what was going to happen. I think we had some moments of slight, I don't know if I could call them spontaneity, but at least slightly unchoreographed moments. And I think the most surprising thing, to me, was the degree to which Kim Jong-un really conveys himself with a confidence and a charisma that is in many ways unprecedented. Perhaps his grandfather, by all historical accounts, had that kind of quality. Certainly his father did not, but he certainly does, and he uses that to great effect. And I think the sort of reverberation of the Kim Jong-un imagery, which we saw a little bit of sort of foreshadowing of when during the Olympics and when his sister went to South Korea. I mean, their willingness to put themselves out there in a certain kind of way in the search for normalcy. I mean, I think there's no question that Kim Jong-un deeply desires to be perceived as being a normal state leader, bringing his wife to the dinner and so on. And I think that part of it was, I hadn't, until you see it, you really don't know what it's going to look like.
And of course, his sister, for everyone listening, accompanied him as well on this little haunt across the DMZ. But in your piece, you make two claims, and you say the centerpiece the peace declaration will be a centerpiece of this, as well as the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, I wonder what you make about these two claims now that you've seen them, because there's been a lot of mentions afterwards. It's easy to get quite excited about these things, of course, and they're quite promising statements in themselves. But a lot of people, and I'm sure you've seen it, have been mentioning afterwards that these are almost plagiarisms of previous commitments that's been made by the previous Kim regimes.
Yeah, I think the problem I have with the coverage that I've seen is that it was often lacking in historical context. There was a kind of breathlessness about it, and I think anybody who's been watching Korea and watching North Korea, South Korea interactions for a long period of time, as I have, feels like, well, okay, I know this movie, I've seen this movie, and there are new actors and the slight differences in the setting for the script, but basically we're following a pretty familiar path. And I think the two Koreas have at many times and gone back to each other, if you will, when they felt threatened by or in some ways felt the fear of abandonment by their great power allies. And the one historical reference point that I haven't seen anybody make, but for me it's very important, is the first North-South joint statement, which was actually made quite deliberately, I think, on July 4th, 1972. And that was when the former KCIA director during the Park Chung-hee era went to Pyongyang. And they issued this statement where they said, desire for peaceful reunification and, sort of mutual understanding of the two Koreas with each other, reunification of the fatherland. I mean, this is rhetoric that was repeated, of course, again in 1992 during the No Tae-woo regime. I mean, go back and look at the joint declaration on denuclearization issued by the two Koreas in 1992. I mean, the language of that is far more extensive and, kind of bold than what we saw this week. And then not to mention, the declarations from 2000 when I think the Kim Dae-jung summit, which was, of course, the real, I think, if you will, breakthrough moment in North-South relations. So, yeah, I mean, there's nothing I saw there that I haven't seen or read before. But obviously the context is different because, this is a North Korea which has established itself as a nuclear weapons state. So it's acting with a confidence and with a goal that I think is a little different than was before. But it's also North Korea that's under significant stress and pressure. So the main thing for me is this is a process driven by the two Koreas and not by the United States, not by China. I mean, we're part of it, but at the moment, it's a Korean-driven process.
So let's talk about that pressure that you just mentioned there. And I see us slowly walking up on your thesis here. So we're just going to build and circle our way in here. So let's talk about that pressure that you're just touching on there. A part of these statements, and this is something that you predicted as well, would be a claims of some more economic integration between the two Koreas. And of course, this has been seen before as well. But why is this so significant, and why is this part of a denuclearization deal?
Well, first of all, I don't know that there ever will be a denuclearization deal, or even if it would meet the definition of denuclearization, which people have in their head. So let's put that to the side for the moment.
Sure.
Underpinnings of this are really crucial. From the North Korean side, I think and this is something I speak a little bit from not only the perspective of having watched Korea for a long time, but also I was the bureau chief of the Christian Science Monitor in Moscow from 1990 to 94. I arrived in the last year and a half, 2 years of perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union. I watched the collapse of the Soviet Union. I watched the struggle to reform it and its collapse. So I have the perspective of what happens to command economies when they reach systemic crisis. I believe the North Koreans have been in a systemic crisis for quite a while, at least since the mid-1990s. But they've managed to survive it in part by through blackmail and other maneuvers. I mean, for a long time they survived by playing the Soviet Union and China off against each other, but from the mid-90s they very successfully used their nuclear weapons program and their ambitions to extract huge amounts of economic aid. And don't forget the progressives who were in power for 10 years, from 1997 when Kim Dae-jung came to power. They basically provided North Korea with the grain, either directly or through fertilizer supplies, that kept them alive for that period of time. It was massive transfers of economic assistance. I think in the last 10 years, when the conservatives were in power and they cut off that flow, it's been a period of real problem for the North Korean regime. So they've become much more reliant on the Chinese, and they had to deal with accepting the reality of marketization, sort of marketization from below, even when they feared the loss of political control that accompanied that. They simply had to accept it because there was no other way for them to survive economically. Then comes the economic sanctions pressure that's been mounting since the Obama administration, but absolutely intensified by the Trump administration and by the Chinese, and I think that's put significant pressure on them. So I think they have an incentive to escape from that pressure and to get to break, if you will, the sort of semi-embargo on the North Korean economy. And the route for them to do that is, once again, as it was, when the progressives were in power before, the advent of a progressive government in South Korea, which is eager to engage North Korea pretty much in the same way that they were at the beginning of the Sunshine Policy. I know a lot of these people personally who are in this government, Moon government. I was a correspondent in the mid '80s when these people were, many of them, out in the streets of Seoul. I sat and watched the battles between the students and the police for a long time, and I interviewed a lot of these people, and I've interviewed many of them since. I know a lot of them personally, as I said, and they have a worldview and a belief in the power of engagement, and as well as I think a kind of almost, it's certainly a nationalist feeling that, reunification, while it's a distant goal, can only come from the two Koreas increasing integration with each other, and the economy is a way for that to start. So I think the main product of this summit meeting is going to be to accelerate that inter-Korean relationship and de facto to begin to break the kind of sanctions regime we've seen. But I think the Moon government understood that they can't go too far down that road without bringing the Americans along. And you can't bring the Americans along without talking nuclear weapons.
So let's move on to the Americans then just briefly here, because you indicate throughout the entire piece that the real goal of this, I mean, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance about the whole meeting, of course, but one of the real most important things about this is it's going to lay the groundwork for a future meeting between America and North Korea. So this is important for North Korea as well, because this is something they have been seeking for the last 45, 50 years, and they've been given it quite quickly, at least in terms of Trump and Kim Jong-un, a very sort of brief movement from 0 to 100 here.
Well, as I said, this is a process shaped by the two Koreas. And don't forget, we were last year, when the Moon administration came to power in June, we were in the midst of increasing fear of war on the Korean Peninsula, and all of the exchange of rhetoric between Trump and Kim Jong-un, the rather open threats of using military action on the part of the United States, the talk about bloody noses and military options and so on. I think all of that, I can't know, of course, what impact it had on the North Korean leadership, but they certainly referred to it repeatedly, so I think it clearly did have some impact, and it may have accelerated their plans, their testing, and so on of both missile systems and nuclear weapons in order to demonstrate that they had this a deliverable capability. But it certainly rattled the South Koreans, and I think that drove to some degree, created a sense of urgency. And, the Moon had reached out to the North Koreans repeatedly last year and gotten no response. He didn't get any response until the beginning of this year, till the New Year's address from Kim Jong-un. And I think that they are absolutely determined to set the stage for the engagement with the U.S. They tried to do that at the Olympics, tried to arrange this rather awkward meeting between Pence and the North Korean delegation led by Kim Jong-un's sister. That didn't work out too well. But they didn't give up. And I give them credit. I give particularly the Moon administration credit for really sticking to this. And they've succeeded. I mean, they've probably beyond their expectations. I'm not even sure that they weren't really surprised when Trump said, "Okay, let's meet." That's the sort of the element of this situation that's really unprecedented for me, is not the sort of policies that we're talking about, the options we're talking about, but the men who are occupying the positions of leadership here, particularly in Pyongyang and Washington, have made this a really hard situation to judge. But so I think that absolutely the goal of this summit meeting last week was to set the stage for the Kim-Trump meeting. I mean, to define the terms. And one of the things on denuclearization that I think has not been well noted in the declaration was, some people said to me, "Oh gosh, they were so vague. Why didn't they say, provide more concrete steps?" I don't think they wanted to. They wanted to keep it vague so they can leave the door open a little bit for things to take place further when Trump meets. And of course, the North Koreans offered this sort of preemptory freeze of testing as a kind of promissory note, if you will. But in that declaration, there is a reference to both to phased demilitarization as well as to these steps that North Korea had already taken, namely the test freeze. I took that as they're trying to define the way that denuclearization is going to be pursued, if it is pursued, is going to be through step-by-step, action for action, gradual movement down some long path. And, I covered the six-party talks. This is the constant subject of discussion that's gone on in this process for 20 years. There's nothing new about this. And the fact that the North Koreans want to go down this road, and that the South Koreans are basically lending their credibility to this, the South Korean government, tells me that it's going to be a very difficult moment when these two men meet. I'm talking about Trump and Kim Jong-un. If the U.S. position is, "Oh, no, we have to go to, we have to have immediate dismantling of nuclear weapons, or on a very, very short timetable before we do anything else." That is a formula that, to me, leads to probably at least to a breakup of the meeting, but I worry that it leads to something much worse.
Well, let's move into Donald Trump then and look at some of the dangers that are inherent in this meeting. You make this claim here, and of course this is pretty unremarkable. People must know this, but you say that there's a risk here that the minute Donald Trump speaks to Kim Jong-un about denuclearization, he is almost by de facto accepting looking and speaking to North Korea as a nuclear nation, and it changes the whole dynamic. It's almost an acceptance by trying to speak them out of it. And this is a danger in itself, because they're now in this unique club of powerful nations. And you say that because Kim Jong-un has come to the table, he has made this good faith gesture, then he already has something in the bank, something that he was probably going to give up anyway, or something that he's probably finished testing anyway. But by coming to the table and saying, I'm going to finish testing, I'm going to finish nuclear testing, at least for the time being, it looks as though he has made this grand gesture, and it's going to be very hard for Donald Trump to reciprocate anything in this sense. And of course, along the whole way is this huge risk of redefining North Korea accidentally as a nuclear state.
Well, of course, that is the North Korean goal. It is the stated goal of the North Koreans, and they have stated it over and over again. Sometimes one of the things I find troubling is that people do not read what the North Koreans say, and when they read it, they say, well, that's just propaganda. No, they actually tend to be very clear about what their intentions are, and they're pretty consistent about carrying through on them. They have said, and it's in their constitution, we are a nuclear power, and we're happy to conduct disarmament talks as talks between two nuclear weapon states. So let's have arms control negotiations. That's what they mean by denuclearization, if you will. That's why it's always denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, because that implies that we're not just talking about North Korea, we're talking about the strategic nuclear weapons capability that the United States retains, at least around the Korean Peninsula. So let's have an arms control conversation. Once you do that, then you've created a really dangerous situation in terms of our alliance management. First of all, you've signaled to the Japanese, our principal security ally in the region, that we're essentially accepting the status quo. And not only that, if you add that to the fact that, and this is what the Japanese are very worried about, and I was spent the last 6 months in Tokyo, so I got this from almost the moment I stepped into Japan last September, this repeated fear that the United States, that Trump would accept a deal which ended effectively the ICBM program by the North Koreans, their long-range missile program, and declared victory because he would have protected the continental United States from attack, and then allowed to basically remain in existence the short and medium range missiles, which are the delivery systems that can reach Japan. So if you allow them to be a nuclear weapon state that retains its missile systems that can target the areas around it, South Korea, Japan, so on, then you've totally altered the premise of American non-proliferation policy for the entire post-war era. I mean, we forced South Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons program. We have repeatedly pushed against any Japanese attempt to go nuclear. I leave aside Trump's strange comments on this, but at least American policy, as conducted by all our governments up till now, has been to attempt to block that pathway. And we have a very important civil nuclear agreement with Japan, for example, which tries to control the fissile material that's created by their civil program. I mean, all of that gets called into question. And I think it's an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. I think I recognize and I sympathize with those colleagues, and there are many of them who are, rallying to this peace process as it's unrolling, because the argument being that this is better than the talk of war. That, and I get that, and in some ways I agree with it, that, the exchanges of threats were extremely dangerous, and it brought us to a situation where you could have misjudgments about and miscalculations about what people did that could lead to escalation. And that was, I think, a very serious fear. And so this, in some sense, we've shifted out of that into this peace process, but it doesn't really end the danger of war at all. It could, in fact, create it on an even more profound scale, because if this process fails, where do we go diplomatically? I mean,
so that is one of the points that's been coming up quite recently, that particular point there. So normally these discussions, and of course you're a long history in diplomacy yourself, so you know this, they start at a very low level and you build up towards these large level summits. But this has gone the opposite way. This has started with a large level summit and with broad agreements, and now it's going to have to fall down and fill in the details along the way. And the problem with a large-scale summit like this, and I think Victor Char's been bringing this up recently, is that if it fails, there is nowhere else to go to. There's just a cliff edge, which is war.
Yeah. No, I thought Victor put that very well, and I know that the people who I know who were engaged in the process of negotiation with North Korea, most of them, not all of them, share that feeling. So, and partly because they go, okay, we know all of the traps, we know all of the things we've done before, and you need to go be able to have some clear idea of what the benchmarks are that you're trying to reach here. And of course, not even unsaid. I mean, the other part of this is that even if there are people around the president who understand all of this, and there clearly are. I mean, John Bolton is he certainly opposes this type of incremental, gradualistic negotiation with North Korea. He did so during the Bush administration, and he's articulated that since. And I've talked to enough people in this government, to know that they have that very clearly in their minds. So even if they're there and they have that view, nobody knows what Donald Trump's going to do when he walks into a room with Kim Jong-un. I mean, the man is unpredictable. Is not even is an inadequate word to describe what may happen. And since he seems to have a limited, at best, understanding of what's going on before him. I mean, he says, "Oh, we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the past," but I'm not even sure he understands what those mistakes are. But the problem is he's now set this thing up, I mean, through his Twitter feed and his responses and so on, that the expectations are, I'm going to get, complete denuclearization. I mean, and nobody believes that's possible. Nobody I know does. And I don't think the South Koreans do. The Moon administration doesn't either. But I think what they're hoping is that they can massage this process. I mean, Moon's going to go to Washington and try and get the United States to accept, something less than that, some gradualistic process. And that it could go that way, no question. But I think inevitably, the problem that, even if we get past this summit, let's say we get some kind of deal, inadequate, but something, it's going to fall apart, very likely, the way all the other ones fell apart, same reason. And then, I can tell you, I wrote that story in part because I had some conversations with people in the intelligence community in this administration that I found rather disturbing, because they're completely cynical about this. And they're basically saying, yeah, let's just do this because we know it's going to fall apart, and then we'll move to what we really need to do, which is to take military action and to overthrow the regime in the North.
And that's one of the points that where you bring John Bolton into this. You speak about Trump and you say he's sort of in this no-win choice. He's going to want to come back with a victory, but he's going to want to come back with a clear path to denuclearization, which of course North Korea are very unlikely to give him with all the verification that is needed. And you paint this picture, at least from those discussions that you mentioned there, of John Bolton going along for this discussion, expecting and that North Korea are going to drop out of it, and already preparing Donald Trump for the next stage, which needs to be war.
I think that Bolton, judging by what he did in the past, and so I have a lot of good friends who served in the State Department during that time period, and I covered the six-party talks myself as a reporter, and the stories of how Bolton was basically the agent of the hardliners in the Bush administration, the Dick Cheney crowd, who their main goal was to destroy the agreed framework, the existing freeze agreement, which, I don't see how we're going to get anything much better than what we did already in 1994, except for the fact that by now that, but when we got that agreement, they hadn't tested a nuclear weapon yet. Now they have forced it away. Freezing. A freeze means you freeze in place a proven nuclear weapons capability. That's a big difference. But anyway, Bolton and those guys, they were out to destroy the agreed framework, and they did their best to stop the people in the State Department who favored engagement and negotiation from carrying out those negotiations. And only after Bolton basically was ousted from the State Department, and we had Condi Rice come over as Secretary of State, and then Christopher Hill embarked on the more serious negotiations, did we get any kind of real diplomacy. But by then, it was very difficult. I mean, look, we got a second freeze agreement in 2008, and don't forget that collapsed again because the North Koreans refused to accept the kind of verification measures which were essential to make that viable. So Bolton knows all this. But Bolton is also a smart, very smart inside player. And, he, and I think Pompeo as well, because he's the other key figure here, they understand the most important thing is stay on maintain your good relationship with Donald Trump. Don't oppose anything that Donald Trump wants to do, and then do your best to try and kind of shape it in the way that you want to, and so that you think it should go. And I think that they're anticipating that this might fail. And I think in Bolton's case, I think he's eagerly anticipating it. I can't speak for Pompeo. I don't know what Pompeo's state of mind is, but I have spoken to people in the intelligence community who were advising Pompeo when he was sitting as CIA director, so I have a little bit of an idea of what maybe he's thinking. And I think these guys, they're not going to, they don't say, no one's going to say no to Donald. I mean, if you say no to Donald, you won't have your job. We already have seen that proven. That's what happened to H.R. McMaster. The only one that said no to him and survived so far is Jim Mattis, and we'll see how long he lasts. So, these guys are going to, they're just going to do their best to get the president to where they think he should be, but then they're going to step back. And, no one's going to stop Donald Trump when he walks into a room. We've already seen that, from doing what he wants to do. So you've kind of hinted at it there, but I might just get you to expand a little bit here. How much of a problem do you think it is that there's such an understaffing in the embassy in Seoul and within the State Department itself? Because what you painted a picture of there is these a few officials around Donald Trump trying to manipulate him in certain ways, and the rest of the figures sort of trying to play catch up and trying to fill in the gaps as they go. So how much of a problem is it that there's such a lack of staff where you need them the most at these sort of times? I think, decision making has been for quite a while completely concentrated in the White House, with the exception of the Pentagon. I mean, I think the Pentagon remains a very powerful force. The State Department was destroyed by Rex Tillerson. And I can tell you that people like Joseph Yun, who was the special envoy for North Korea, who did some great work. He went to North Korea and he brought back Otto Warmbier, unfortunately in a coma, and he did, made great efforts to open negotiation channels with North Koreans. But largely, and I don't think I'm speaking too much out of school here. I'm just someone I've known for quite a while. Largely, he did that on his own. On his own. I mean, there was no coordination with the NSC, very little with the White House. He describes it as a chaotic situation. I don't think people realize how bad it is. And now I think, Pompeo is sitting over in the State Department and people saying, oh, this is great. He's going to bring the State Department back into the game, and maybe we'll finally get some appointments. We have no ambassador. Now we had no ambassador in South Korea. Now we've appointed Admiral Harris, a choice I'm not particularly enthusiastic about, and for reasons I could explain if you're interested. But the reality is that I think that Pompeo is going to be more of the kind of Secretary of State we've seen, like with Henry Kissinger or with even Condi Rice, which is a Secretary of State who basically relies on their personal relationship to the president and doesn't really the rest of the building, the bottom, the 6 floors below him, are not really that engaged. And I say this sadly as the son of a career Foreign Service officer with many, many, many friends in the Foreign Service, including many retirees, that, that role is just not what it used to be. And unfortunately, that's where real expertise lies. I mean, people who've spent years and years trying to understand Korea, no one's talking to them. And I don't think they're going to be talked to. There's some people in the intelligence community who are being drawn on, but honestly, they don't have active experience as negotiators, and that's a very important thing. So, yeah, it's going to be thin, but in the end, I guess you could argue that Donald Trump has already said, I believe at one point, he said, "I don't need any of these people. I am the foreign policy of the United States." And I think he spoke the truth, at least from the point of view of himself.
So what are the chances, do you think, that the North Koreans managed to get something over Donald Trump here? Because as you're well aware, there's this sort of game in these sort of negotiations of putting the right piece of delicate language in there. So you just touched on it earlier when you said, what does denuclearization mean for each party? So one side says denuclearization means no more testing in their head, and you just write down denuclearization, they're going to accept it as that. And the South Koreans and the Americans may have a very different idea. And there's always this game of putting the right sort of testing in there. It's always that famous one that I think the North Koreans did after the agreed framework of agreeing to halt missile tests, and then they started doing satellite tests.
Yeah. Well, if we get an actual agreement, then I think the North Koreans, they're very well prepared for this. First of all, unlike on the U.S. side, the people who are doing the negotiating and handling this on the North Korean side are deeply experienced people. They've been doing this for a long time. And by the way, that's true to some degree in the Moon administration as well. The Moon administration is staffed by people who've had a lot of experience dealing with North Korea. They were involved in the 2 previous summits in many cases, or they actually, whatever one may think about their views, they know what they're doing, but North Koreans definitely know what they're doing. So I think they will seek an agreement of the kind we've already seen. It'll have large, great declarations of the end point: peace regime, peace treaty, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, all that large language. And after all, go back and look at for example, the September 2005 statement issued by the 6-party talks. I don't think we could do a whole lot better than that in terms of a declaratory statement. It was a very good statement. But then, of course, all these things have foundered on the process of implementation. And it becomes even more difficult now because we don't even know where the North Koreans have, maybe we know it, I don't know, but we don't know where the North Koreans have their uranium enrichment facilities. We only know the one that they've shown everybody, which is in Yongbyon. But it's clear there's at least one more, if not others. And those are very hard to detect. It's not like detecting a reactor that you can use to produce spent fuel and extract plutonium. That you can see. You can stick a uranium enrichment facility in a building somewhere and you'll never see it. It doesn't give off a signature or anything like that. So, I think the North Koreans could easily give Donald Trump some of the kind of visible concessions that look good. As I said, I anticipate they will offer maybe even to not only end testing, but to end their ICBM program, period, even to dismantle long-range missiles. Why not? They don't really need them, actually, from a nuclear deterrent point of view. So that could be a big wow victory. Even I have a colleague who said, well, maybe the North Koreans will say, here, we'll give you 5 nuclear weapons as a gesture of our compliance, knowing that they have plenty of fissile material, and it doesn't take, once you've done it once, you can assemble a warhead without any problem. There are lots of things they can do that can be, I think, quite dramatic in effect. So I think it's quite possible we could end up with something that looks, not bad, and people will be hailing it, and the sanctions regime will be over, and beyond, but it won't take very long. Maybe who knows? But eventually, they'll return to what they were doing before if relations break down. So I think you can have victory in the short term of a certain kind, or as the president keeps on saying, if I don't like what I hear, we'll walk out. But they're thinking that, and I've heard this from U.S. officials, they're thinking we'll walk out and it'll be evident that we were reasonable and the North Koreans refused to denuclearize seriously, so we walked out. No, I don't think that's the way it's going to work. I think the way it's going to work is that the rest of the world, including the South Koreans and certainly the Chinese and the Russians, and maybe a lot of people even in the U.S. will say, no, the North Koreans were willing to do something. It may not have been full denuclearization, but it was a start, and you guys are unreasonable and hardline, and we'll end up being the ones who are isolated. And I saw this before in the six-party talks. In the early phases of the six-party talks, the Americans said, we're going to isolate the North Koreans. It'll be 5 against 1. No, it ended up being 4 against 2, with the South Koreans under the progressive government at that time, basically lining up with the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Russians, and it was we and the Japanese who were left looking like, the hardliners. In the end, we had to come back and engage the North Koreans in negotiations after they had tested a nuclear weapon, which we said was red line of red lines. So, a little bit of history, it's useful,
Let's dig a little bit deeper in there, actually. So let's pretend that the summit does fail, that there's this point where Donald Trump does decide they're not serious and I'm going to walk away. For whatever reason he does it. Now, you touched on earlier and you said you wish people would listen more to North Korea and to what they actually say that they want. And one of the things that they do say again and again and again is that all the problems in their country will be solved by future reunification. And in your article, you come to this, that one of the points of this is they cannot have a future reunification with American troops on the peninsula. And of course, there's a still, particularly in the younger generation within South Korea, a strong attachment to America and the American alliance. So you say, if America walk away, that they may be blamed for this. And this is just what North Korea wants. It's a way that they can begin to separate South Korea away from their great ally. And then to sort of show that, well, if America are the enemy of the process, then we are your friends. And this is a step towards a reunification that at the moment doesn't look very likely.
Well, there's this debate in Washington, and you can hear echoes of it in South Korea as well. It's sort of are nuclear weapons in North Korea simply a means of regime survival, or are they an instrument of intimidation that leads to eventually the reunification of the Korean Peninsula under North Korean leadership and the ouster of the U.S.? I think it's a little bit of an artificial debate, the way it's posed, because I think that it is in some ways both. I think there's a large element of regime survival and deterrence involved in the nuclear weapons program, certainly for the sake of extracting concessions. It's an instrument of economic blackmail that's been pretty effective. But I do think that the North Korean leadership retains, at least a sort of somewhere in the back of their minds, they are still engaged in a struggle for leadership and legitimacy on the Korean Peninsula. Both Koreas call themselves Korea. Americans don't tend to know that. We call it the Republic of Korea. We don't really understand what we're talking. We refer to it sometimes as South Korea.
And of course, for people listening, it's just they want to catch in here. A lot of the statements in the outcome that they published after this and they signed, this is claims of the destiny of the Korean nation, and it talks of the reconnection of blood relations and the future of co-prosperity and unification.
So who is the real Korea is still a question. Who really represents the true Korea? I remember talking to student radicals in the 80s, some of whom, as I said, are now in power, who admired North Korea, not because they were communists, but because they thought the North Koreans were the true Koreans. They were purer. They weren't these sort of, under the thumb of foreigners. I mean, it's a lie, of course, because the Juche was always a lie. I mean, they depended on the ideology of self-reliance. I mean, that they depended, of course, on the aid from outside. But anyway, they had somehow a purer Koreanness about them, and you can still see this propaganda war that goes on. I mean, the South Koreans are doing, they've got Red Velvet and they're doing hip, pop music, K-pop that is clearly shaped by the West, but the North Koreans are still, singing the great, folk songs and ballads of the real Korea. So there's still this war going on, and I think it was symbolically important, and I give the Moon administration this, to have Kim Jong-un step across the DMZ line into what is technically South Korean territory, which they haven't done before. So there's a slight degree of concession of legitimacy of South Korea, and I still think that that is still out there somewhere, and I personally dream of and hope for the reunification of Korea. It's a historical crime for which the United States bears some serious responsibility, although we didn't intend it that way. We didn't intend the division to be permanent. But nonetheless, it's a consequence of the way the war ended, World War II ended. And, there shouldn't be two Koreas. There's always been one Korea. So somewhere along, I hope, in my lifetime, Korea is reunified. Hopefully not under the rule of the North regime. Yes. And I think that in that struggle for legitimacy, it's a complicated struggle. The problem with South Korean progressives, and even conservatives to some degree, is that they disarm themselves in that struggle by hesitating to bring up issues like human rights and to talk frankly, be able to talk frankly about the nature of the regime in the North. And I believe that there are millions of North Koreans, many millions of North Koreans, who, when reunification, if and when it takes place, and they're freed from the terror and the repression they've lived under, will point a finger at these people in South Korea who ended up being apologists for the regime in the North.
Yeah, so just on that point that you mentioned earlier, I mean, it's hard to mention Juche without bringing in Professor Brian Myers here. So there's a claim that you make inside the article where you say that this is likely just a great big disingenuous effort, that no matter what happens, somewhere down the line, North Korea will find an excuse to go back to testing, as they have time and time again. And one of the things that people noticed about this is, as it was being live streamed all over the world, this grand meeting, back inside North Korea, it wasn't being streamed at all. In fact, they were showing a day of documentaries about the previous leader, Kim Jong-il. And this sort of claim that it's hard to take them seriously when the internal rhetoric inside North Korea is still about the American race enemy and this building up of a cult of personality. And it's hard to take them seriously unless they're willing to shift that internal propaganda.
Well, by the way, the what you quoted me saying was not me saying it. I was quoting U.S. intelligence community officials saying that they basically anticipate that, at some point the North Koreans are going to, violate whatever agreement, and then we're going to pounce on them, which I think is also a little bit of their own fantasy life, to tell you the truth. But because the process will have moved on, we will be isolated. But in any case, I don't know. I know that initially they did not show the live stream, but I just saw the photographs of the front page of Nodong Shinmun and the North Korean Party Daily, and it's filled with photographs. And I suspect this will be like the Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un meeting in Beijing, that they need a day to start to then produce their own sort of documentary version of what happened. They didn't do that until Kim had left China, and then they produced a version which course, place their guy at the center of things. And it'll be interesting to see how they portray these events in North Korea for sure. And I do also think it's important that they can't control the flow of information inside North Korea the way they used to. I mean, I'm impressed from my conversations I've had over the years with defectors that it's a sieve, and that's a consequence of the breakdown of the command economy, the forced marketization, which meant that the North Koreans had to open the border with China in order to get the even basic commodities they needed to keep their population going. And with that came information. And they can't, I don't think the North Korean population is quite as controlled sometimes as Brian seems to think they are. But, that's a matter of debate.
Sure. So you just mentioned there, and I suppose just to begin to round this out, we've got to mention two countries that come into this. So firstly, you just mentioned Xi Jinping, and of course Kim Jong-un visits that country previously, and it's a precursor to this summit itself. So you mentioned at a few points that if you're going to relieve sanctions or put on sanctions, it's going to be all about China. If they're going to bring this, if we're going to denuclearize North Korea, it's going to be all about China. And if we're going to go to war with North Korea, once again, it's going to have to go through China. And of course, there's this claim that when they closed down that mountain, their test site, that this wasn't a concession to anybody other than China, because that mountain's right on their border. When they test, the ground shakes, and of course the mountain is collapsing in on itself. So, what do you make of the role China's going to have to play in all of this?
I know I've seen some things that say, well, the Chinese are feeling isolated and they're feeling, like they're going to be left out. I don't think so. I really don't believe that. I think they made a decision to join the U.S. and putting the squeeze to some degree on the North Koreans. And, there's no love lost, as we know, between the North Koreans and the Chinese, and between Kim, I think, and Xi. But they, at a crucial moment, he went to Beijing. He paid proper, kind of obeisance to the emperor. And I think for the Chinese, this is all going really well. Chinese, I'm convinced over the years of talking to Chinese who deal with North Korea, their number one priority is to avoid an escalation of conflict which leads to a much greater American military presence in the Korean Peninsula. That's their strategic priority, and everything else is secondary. And of course, ultimately they would love to have the U.S. off the Korean Peninsula if they can get that. So I think the Chinese are going to be pretty happy about what's going on. I believe, by the way, that Kim Jong-un will meet with Putin before his summit with Trump. I anticipate that because I think he likes to try and, maybe balance the Chinese a little bit with the Russians. It's not completely effective, but it's useful for them. But I think, he's shoring up his relationships there as he heads into this meeting. And so I think the Chinese are happy. Chinese are happy. Russians probably happy. South Koreans are happy. Donald Trump is happy, but I don't think he knows why.
Well, let's move on to someone who might not be happy then. You mentioned in the article that Japan will be on the sidelines of this, as is painfully evident, effectively isolated from the main stage. And of course, Shinzo Abe, after the summit, gave the sort of expected promises and commitments, and sort of cheered it along as he should. But one of the things that almost comically began to overshadow this was the idea that the dessert on the dinner they had a little picture of Dokdo Island on it off the coast, and of course the Japanese, this caused quite a stir inside Japan. And of course you've lived in Japan for a very, very long time, and you run this program at Stanford called Divided Memories, which is this historical, the problem of historical pain and historical narrative. And of course this is heavily to do with Japan. So what is Japan what is it going to be looking like for Japan looking in from the outside on this process?
Well, I think the Japanese are deeply worried about where this is headed. And that's not only true of Japanese conservatives. I hear that from Japanese liberals as well, because they worry, as we talked earlier, about a deal which leaves them effectively still vulnerable, but then strategically separated from the United States. And that, for the Japanese, is the most dangerous situation to be in. So they don't trust the North Koreans. On the other hand, I think the Japanese, they're very pragmatic people, and they are already starting to engage in hedging behavior. We're going to have the trilateral China Japan-South Korea summit meeting on May 9th, and the Japanese are, Abe is trying to get to China as soon as he can. There's a real attempt, and of course he's in deep domestic political trouble, so he needs some success on the foreign policy front. So I think and if this thing rolls along with North Korea, if the Kim-Trump summit meeting goes well, I wouldn't be surprised to see Abe follow in his footsteps. And of course we have the long delayed final settlement of the issue of the Japanese abductees, which, if it's done in a way that's satisfactory to Japan, would trigger a massive payout by Japan to North Korea in the form of sort of the long delayed, wartime reparations, in effect. So Japanese could play it both ways, but I think they're very, very worried about where this is going. I have not seen a report yet of Moon's conversation with Abe, and I'll be interested to see if he tells Abe, which the Japanese really are hoping to hear, that somehow or other he mentioned or raised the abductee issue with Kim Jong-un. I mean, even if he didn't, he probably will tell us that he did. And this has a strange, resonance in Japan. I mean, not strange in the sense that people, of course, it's a very emotional story of people who were snatched off the beaches at the age of 14 and so on. But it's also, the Japanese media just focuses on this to a degree, by the way, that makes American officials go nuts, because they go, why are you, this is the only thing you care about. What about nuclear weapons? Isn't that a little more important? But anyway, that's a, complicated, historical question, if you will.
Yep. So just as a final question here, you end off the piece, and of course it is quite pertinent. You say, this is how the declaration of peace this week in Korea could lead relentlessly to war. And of course we've built this picture up where there's these traps all the way along this process, where war is always just around the corner, and by actually having the talks you'd be moving faster to war, not slower. It's almost an oxymoron there. So are you hopeful about this, and how hopeful are you?
No, I'm deeply apprehensive about it, but I also recognize that, we're in the kind of bizarre situation that I've never seen before, frankly, mainly because of who's the president of the United States. And I think I ended that piece, with talking about Trump's unpredictability. So
yeah, the final words is Donald Trump is of course, when it comes to the decisions of Donald Trump, nothing is predictable.
Yeah, so who knows? I mean, maybe we end up with the some kind of big bang deal that shifts the geopolitics of the region, and off we go. I would love to see that in some ways, and I would stress this one thing. I absolutely think it's better that they're talking than that they're making threats against each other. That in the short run, this is good, because it'll reduce tensions and it'll reduce the risk, at least in the short run, of war. What I worry about is what happens after that, and maybe it'll take some while to unravel. And after all, we've been at this now for decades with North Korea, and there's no reason to believe that there's a fast and easy way out of this.
Okay, that sounds like a good note to end this on. The article that we've been speaking about throughout this is called A Declaration of Peace That Leads to War, and it's in the Toyo Keizai. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Toyo Keizai.
Okay. And the link is attached to this podcast. And of course, for anyone interested, I recommend you go to Stanford's website and check out the Divided Memories project. It's quite impressive. And there are 3 books that Daniel has co-edited that are attached to that project. So Daniel Sneider, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.